friends and brothers. This is Justin Jones with Masonic Improvement. I'm joined here with my co-host, Brother Dennis Yates. How you doing, Dennis?
Wonderful. And tonight is an awesome night. It's a spectacular night because we have the one, the only Pete Norman on our show. And if you don't know him, like Texas Masons know him, then you'll get a delight in getting to get to know him. If you ever had a question on anything historical about Freemasonry or ritualistic in Freemasonry, this is the guy. So without any further ado, I am so pleased and happy to have our good friend and brother Pete Norman on our show. We'll be talking about best in practice lodges as we've been doing lately on the show. So Pete, thank you so much for showing up.
You're saying best in practice. We would say best practice or best practices lodge.
This is exactly what I mean, brothers. Pay attention. Okay. This is the guy. This is the guy. He knows what he's talking about. Yep. And in all reality, I'm going to fix my lighting as we go here. In all reality, this is where Justin and I got the phrase. It wasn't us that coined this phrase. It was St. Alban's Lodge that coined this phrase. And we really want to highlight the best in what lodges can and should be doing for not only its members, but the fraternity as a whole. And so we have been corrected now. For now on, we have to say best practice lodges.
There we go.
Well, that's a term that we came up with back in the early 90s. Truthfully, it may not have come about until the late 90s because St. Alban's Lodge was created in 1992. And about 10 years later, we started to hear about traditional observance lodges. And people would say to us, "Oh, you're a traditional observance lodge." Well, we never called ourselves that. And so in our defense, we just said, well, we're a traditional best practices lodge. So we kind of invented that term for ourselves.
Nice. And that also gets you away from the Committee on Work Police that that start worrying about when people call themselves traditional lodges and things like that and not.
Yeah. The whole problem, and I was president of the Masonic Restoration Foundation for about 3 years. And we had national meetings in New Hampshire and Oakland, California, and I forget where all we went. But the point was that when you say traditional observance lodge to 100 people, there's 100 different definitions out there in their heads. And not a one of them has the same definition that you originally meant when you said it. So that's why we don't like to use that term is because if I said traditional observance lodge and I mean what I know it means, somebody else hears me say it, they think it means something else. So we just don't use the term. Anyway.
Yeah, typically tradition means that's not how we've always done it in our lodge. So that's I certainly understand why you might have that concern.
Yeah, it's definitely
open for when people say, whenever somebody says that's not how we've always done it, what they mean is that's not how we've done it since I've been a Mason, which was 7 years ago, right? Or
yes,
whenever.
Yes. Oh, I'm so happy to have you on the show. So, Brother Pete, or I should say Brother Norman, to be correct in how we should present and talk to each other. Tell us, why did you join Freemasonry?
I was fascinated with it. I didn't know anything about Freemasonry. My father was not a Mason. Neither of my grandfathers. I didn't have anybody in my family that was a Mason. But when I was in college, at the Great Athletic and Military Institute of the Brazos, also known as Texas A&M. During my junior and senior years, on cold days in January and February, I would find myself up on the fourth floor of the library looking for a cozy place to go hide for a couple hours between classes. And I would browse the shelves looking at different books. And I discovered a shelf full of books about Freemasonry. And I just thought, what is this Freemasonry? Right. So I pulled 2 or 3 or 4 of the books down and carried them over to my little desk and sat there and started going through it. And I was absolutely fascinated with this fraternity that had existed since the 1600s or 1700s, that apparently still existed. It had not died out in the 1800s like you might imagine. And so the more I read about it, the more fascinated I became. Well, like I said, that was my junior and senior year of when I was in college. And after I graduated, I went into the Air Force. And over the next 10 years, I would buy books on Freemasonry whenever I came across them. And Dennis and I were talking about this earlier. And I said, back in those days, there was no Amazon, there was no internet, and there were no Barnes and Noble's bookstores. So I would be driving down the street one day in some major city, and I'd see an old beat up house that had a sign out front that said used books. And I'd nearly wrecked my car getting off the road. And I'd go in and I'd ask the guy behind, there's a guy with a cat, sitting behind the counter, and he's smoking his pipe, and I would say, do you have any books about Freemasonry? And he'd say, yeah, back in the occult section, So of course, so I'd go back into the occult section and I would look for these books on Freemasonry. And sometimes there was no more than 1 or 2 books, but no matter what the book was, I'd buy it. Right. So it was completely random. It wasn't like today where people can go on Amazon and find the exact book they're looking for and then find 2 or 3 more books just like it and buy them all. Mm-hmm. No, in those days, you bought whatever there was, right? And so little by little over the next 10 years, I built a little shelf of my own, a little library, maybe a couple of dozen books. And that was my introduction to Freemasonry. And it wasn't until I'd been out of the Air Force for a couple of years and in the late 70s, and I was at my father-in-law's house, and he had his keys and his change and his rings and everything sitting up on the mantle. And I noticed that he had a 14th degree ring. And I picked it up and I said, Bill, I didn't know you were a Mason. And he said, what do you know about that? Give me that ring. And he took it away from me. And he said, what do you know about that? I said, I know that's a 14th degree ring. And he said, how do you know that? I said, I read books. And so I asked him, I said, how do you join the Masons? Because I had no idea. I'd been reading about it for 10 years, but I didn't know how you join. And he says, oh, well, you go down to Madeley's drugstore and talk to Mr. Madeley, the pharmacist back in the back, and he'll get you an application. Okay. So the next day I'm down there introducing myself to Mr. Madeley, and he rummages around in a drawer, takes out the Scotch tape and the stapler, and here we go. And he pulls out this form and hands it to me. And he said, fill that out. And you'll need some recommendations and some recommenders and so forth, and bring it back and we'll get you started. And I was like, okay. So I was off and running. And I told Dennis earlier, I said, he gave me a little directory for the lodge. And he said, you'll find a lot of names in here, and maybe you'll find some people that you can use as references. So I started looking through the book, and I noticed they had committees. The lodge had committees. And this was in College Station. And one of the committees was Lodge of Instruction. And I thought, oh, that sounds really interesting. It sounds like they'll have a book club that'll meet on Tuesday night, right? You know, and everybody will read the same book, and you'll go down there on Tuesday night. We'll have coffee, and then we'll discuss this book. We'll have Lodge of Instruction. You know, imagine how disappointed I was when I found out what Lodge of Instruction actually was. And they didn't have it, you know, they had monthly meetings, and I'd go, and we'd have spaghetti on paper plates, and you know, watered down iced tea in styrofoam cups. And then we'd go into the lodge room, and at 7 o'clock, they'd start the meeting. And it was a typical 1.5 hour long business meeting that you're all familiar with. And it was like, this doesn't match with, I mean, I've been reading about Freemasonry for 10 years. You know, I read about Freemasonry in Europe. I read about Freemasonry all over the world. This doesn't match with what I've been reading, right? And so I was junior deacon the next year. After I got to be a master mason, they made me junior deacon. And I went to the worshipful master and said, could I give a program, like a 20-minute program with slides? And he said, what do you talk about? And I went, Masonic symbolism. You know, I'll put something together. And he goes, yeah, sure. He said, we've always got about 30 minutes before the meeting starts, between 6:30 and 7. You can do it then. I said, okay, fine. So the next month I did a program, and they liked it so much that they started doing it every month, and they got different guys. And we had a nice little library at the lodge. So they'd give them a book and say, here, find something in this book and give us a program next month. And that was like 1980, and they're still doing it.
Nice. That's a great idea. Giving them a book and saying, find something in this book to do this on.
Well, I got crossways one time with one of our past masters. The guy's a PhD, and I don't know what in, but he's a PhD, and he got to be secretary. This is my mother lodge, and they started bringing in Officer Bob to come talk about the neighborhood watch program, and then the next month they'd have Fireman Bill come talk about safety in the home, and then the next month they'd have somebody from the George Bush Library come talk about the first ladies' dresses that they have in a big collection, and then they had some lady come talk about CNI dogs and how to train them and all that stuff, and it had nothing to do with Freemasonry whatsoever. Month after month, they had some guy from the Chamber of Commerce come talk to us about the new lake they're going to put in over on the Navasota River, and I was really dissatisfied with these non-Masonic programs, and so I complained to the lodge secretary. We're out in the hallway, and our lodge has a really nice library. Actually, our building now is called the Brazos Valley Masonic Library and Museum. And it's a 501c3, and the lodge actually pays rent to meet there. And so we have a pretty nice library, several thousand volumes that we've collected over the years. And nice. I was talking to him out in the hallway, and I was complaining about these programs. And he said, but Pete, he said, if we did a program on Masonry every month, wouldn't we soon run out of programs? And I just gently took him by the arm, and I led him over to the door of the library, and I waved my hand across these 6,000 volumes of books. We've got a complete collection of Quater Coronati. We've got a complete collection of the Scottish Rite Research Society. We've got a complete collection of all the volumes of the Texas Lodge of Research, not to mention everything else we've got. And I said, Bob, if all you did was pull one program out of one book every month, we couldn't get to the end of the library before we were both dead. I mean, if that's all you did. And I think you could probably pull a pretty good program out of each book every month if 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 that's what you wanted to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's my frustration with most lodges, and I think most lodges don't know anything. Most Masons don't know anything about Masonry, unfortunately. What they know is they know the ritual. They got it down cold. They memorize it. They work on it, right? And they're good ritualists, many of them. And they get certificates in the ritual and so on and so on and so on. But they don't know anything about Masonry. They don't know about its history. And so you get some lodge and you get a worshipful master in there, and he wants to have a really good year. So what does he do? He does what he knows. So what does he know? Well, he knows how to have a fish fry, and he knows how to have a barbecue, and he knows how to sell smoked turkeys at Thanksgiving or Christmas and raise money. He knows how to have a blood drive. And so basically most lodges turn themselves into clones of Lions clubs. That's all they are, is they're Lions clubs with ritual.
Yes, sir. A lot of things you described they have a very low bar to entry. And I think that's why it's appealing for a lot of these people with no real experience with the literature on Freemasonry and things like that. They want to have activity. They don't really know what to do, and so they go to the lowest hanging fruit, which is frying fish or something like that. When
it's what they already know.
It's what they already know. Exactly.
Yeah. They don't have to open a book. They don't have to have a book.
Yes, sir. Well, I was going to ask you, how did the reality of Freemasonry compare with your expectations? I think we touched on that pretty well. Did you have anything else you wanted to add on that, or like to expound on?
I think one of the things y'all wanted to know was, how did we get around to starting St. Albans Lodge?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
And that was kind of a happy accident. Back in the late 80s, I got to know some of the Masons at other lodges in our district. And among them, I found other Masons that were more or less like me and had the same interests. And so we would sit around and lament that we didn't have the Masonry we wanted, that I wasn't getting the kind of Masonry that I'd read about and that I knew existed back in the beginning. And so we talked about creating a lodge from scratch, just create one from scratch. And we would sit down and design it. So 6 of us actually sat down one night at a local restaurant, and I had put together some worksheets, fill in the blank, like, what's the name of this lodge going to be, and what night will we meet, and how often do we meet, what are our dues going to be, and what are our meetings going to be like, and what should the dress be, and all of those kind of basic questions. And so we designed a lodge from scratch on paper, and we put together a number of people that were interested in being charter members. And so we started by having 4 quarterly festive boards without a lodge. We just had festive boards.
Nice.
A couple of 3 or 4 restaurants here in the local area. And by the fall, we were able to send a petition to Grand Lodge and request a charter. So we were never a lodge under dispensation. We went directly to charter, right? And so we got our charter in December 1992, and we were set to labor in February, actually, by Robert L. Dillard, who at that point in time was the senior living past Grand Master in Texas, and assisted by Jack Kelly, both of them past masters of Texas Lodge Research. So they were good friends of mine. And that's how the lodge got started. We knew that we did not want to meet every month. We knew that Grand Lodge law would allow us to meet 4 or 5 times a year, provided that we met quarterly. And so that's kind of how we got started. The other thing, and I made some notes here. So here's the recipe, basically.
Nice.
The first thing on the list is books. And we've already talked about that. If your lodge doesn't have a copy of Coyle's Masonic Encyclopedia and Mackey's Encyclopedia and a few other good books about Masonry, then that's the first thing you need to do. You need to have a source for your information about Freemasonry and its history and symbolism, philosophy, etc. We talked about meetings. One of the things that we do now, and we've evolved a little bit over the years, our lodge now has 7 stated meetings. Well, I'm sorry, let me back up. We were smart enough to write our bylaws so that we meet monthly. The bylaws permit us to meet monthly. But like every other lodge in the state, the Worshipful Master has the ability to cancel a meeting. And so at the beginning of the year, we sit down, and the secretary and the Worshipful Master, we work out the calendar, and we decide which 7 months we're going to meet and which 5 months we're going to be dark. And, so it's almost every other month throughout the year. We've also separated our meetings into 2 kinds of meetings. So we have 3 business meetings that are purely business. And these are just about as boring as any other lodge meeting in the state of Texas. There's one in February when we receive the district deputy. There's one in June when we elect new lodge officers. And there's one in September and we receive the district deputy again. And at those 3 meetings, we have a full agenda where we do all the usual business that most lodges do. And we laugh about the fact that our lodge takes care of all of its business in 3 meetings, whereas most other lodges, they need 12 meetings to get their business done. Well, we don't. We get ours done in 3 meetings.
I think that is awesome.
The other thing we didn't do was we didn't read the minutes. Instead, we would hand the minutes out to everybody as a copy before the meeting. And if there were no additions, deletions, corrections, they could stand approved as written. And now, of course, that's encoded in Grand Lodge law. As long as you lay the minutes on the secretary's desk an hour before the meeting, you can do that.
So now it's okay that you let the cat out of the bag. So
yeah, we're legal now, I guess.
Right, exactly.
Well, there's nothing in Grand Lodge law that says you have to read the minutes.
Right.
And somebody told me, well, back in the dark ages, there was a Grand Master's decision that said you had to read them. Well, okay, well, we do read them. We just don't read them out loud. And I've never seen that Grand Master. Nobody's ever brought it to my attention. So for 30 some odd years, we got by. Now it's encoded into Grand Lodge law. And everybody's happy. So that takes care of the minutes. So that explains the 3 business meetings we have. So then we have 4 quarterly meetings. And those meetings are in January, April, July, and October. At the July meeting, we install officers. We've always installed officers at our July stated meeting. It's always a tiled installation. We've never had an open installation. Thank God. I'm sorry, there's people out there that love open installations. I can't stand going to an open installation where you see teenagers sitting on the back row fiddling with their iPhones because they're bored to tears. And the only reason they're there is because Uncle Charlie's being installed as junior deacon and he invited them. And their parents said, you have to go because Uncle Charlie's going to be some kind of officer at the Masonic Lodge. And he'd be really disappointed if you're not there. So this kid's sitting on the back row fiddling with his iPhone, checking Facebook or whatever he's doing, and you have all the usual array of mothers-in-law, sisters-in-law, and brothers-in-law sitting on the sidelines. And then you get some guy, some past master of the lodge, who has to stand there and explain every little detail in the lodge. He has to explain the master's hat to the ladies, why he's wearing a hat. He has to explain the plumb, square, and level that appear on the three major stations in the lodge room. He has to explain who the senior deacon and the junior deacon are, and the stewards, and all this excruciating detail to all these non-Masons. So
It sounds like you've been to my lodge before.
the whole thing becomes performance to entertain the non-Masons in the room. It is no longer for the lodge. It's no longer for the lodge members. It's no longer for the lodge officers. It's for all these non-Masons who most of them would rather not be there, frankly, right? So we've never had an open installation of officers, and our lodge is quite happy with that. So we do that at the we open at 7:00. We take care of all the business we need to, and we install the officers, and we close at 8. We do the whole thing in 1 hour.
Wow.
Okay.
Man.
We don't drag it out for 2.5 hours. Okay. So those are the 4 quarterlies. And those 4 quarterlies we refer to as a Lodge of Light, because it was our intent, our purpose, to create an excellent lodge experience, to create a lodge meeting that members would actually look forward to coming to, that's not going to have committee reports and balloting and people arguing about how many new aprons we need to buy, and all the other nonsense that goes on at most stated meetings at most lodges. So what we do is we take care of what little business we have to in the first 10 minutes of the meeting, and then we devote the rest of the meeting to Masonic light, and we do that through 2 readings. And these readings are taken straight out of reputable Masonic books. And so 1 month we may have 2 readings about the checkered pavement, or we may have 2 readings about the level. I mean, you can imagine if you have a Mackey's encyclopedia, you could probably make a list of 100 different themes that you could give these readings about.
Right.
And these readings are only about 2 pages double spaced. So it only takes about 10 minutes to do one of these readings. And between the 2 readings, we have a musical interlude where we play some classical music. And it's always something relaxing. We have a darkened lodge room, and you can look around the room and you can see the guys just kind of taking a deep breath and just taking a mental break for about 3 to 4 minutes while this little piece of classical music plays. The meeting itself begins with a procession into the lodge room. So we line up out in the hallway. The procession is led by the master of ceremonies and the marshal, and then visitors 2 by 2, followed by members of the lodge 2 by 2, followed by past masters of the lodge 2 by 2, followed by officers of the lodge, beginning with the lowest, the stewards, and working their way up. And finally, the master at the end of the procession is last. And we have a particular piece of music that we play. It's by Handel, and it's called Sarabande, and that's our entrance processional. And so we process into a darkened lodge room that's lit by candles, and you can actually feel the difference when you go from outside of the sanctum sanctorum and into the sanctum sanctorum, and the music's playing and everybody circles around the altar in a clockwise fashion, and everybody passes the east one time, and then they find a place to sit, but they don't sit, they remain standing. And then the master and the wardens continue around and pass the altar a second time. Pass the east a second time. And then the wardens peel off and go to their stations. And the worshipful master makes one last circuit around the lodge by himself. And then he ascends to the east and starts the opening ceremony. During this period, while the officers are going around the lodge, everybody stands on the sign of fidelity. And the sign of fidelity is a esoteric sign. I've got a book about emulation ritual that they use in England, and it explains the sign of fidelity and how it originated and so on and so forth. And the sign of fidelity, being a esoteric sign, is only used in a tiled meeting or in a lodge room that's going to be tiled, like, for instance, this. And so while the officers are rotating around, everybody stands on the sign of fidelity. And I can't show you because,
right.
If you don't know what it is, well, come to St. Albans sometime and you'll find out. Either that or go to any lodge in England or lodges around the world use it. And that's one of the great things, is that our members learn about these universal practices so that if they're on a business trip to Hong Kong or Rio de Janeiro or anywhere, they won't be confused about things because they learned them at their home lodge back in College Station, Texas, right?
Nice.
We use real candles. We don't have the funny little light bulbs with the little glowing square and compass. We don't do that. We don't think that's cool. We like real candles. In fact, we're so fussy that we only use pure beeswax.
Awesome.
In fact, pure beeswax candles give off a little bit different glow than paraffin candles that you buy at Walmart. So be aware.
Interesting.
So we've talked about music. We've talked about the candles. We use a little bit of incense. And I'll be honest with you, I was not really sold on the idea of using incense until I visited Enlightenment Lodge in Colorado Springs. Oh, golly, almost 20 years ago now. And we processed into that lodge room. It was a darkened lodge room with candles, and they had incense burning in the anteroom. And so as you passed through the anteroom, you got a whiff of this incense, and it stayed with you the rest of the way. And what I noticed was that it wiped out the funky smell that most lodges have.
Yes.
I had a good friend that was an architect, and he called it a lodgiferous smell.
A lodgiferous. I like
Because
that.
every lodge had that same smell. But
Oh,
what
man.
that did was that covered the smell. The other thing I noticed was that the music during the processional, it discouraged people talking. So instead of having guys joking and talking and whispering to each other, you didn't have that because you couldn't. You'd almost have to yell it to each other to be heard over the music.
Hmm.
And then the third thing was that the darkened lodge room, lit by candles, that hid the imperfections in the lodge room. So you didn't see the stain on the carpet. You didn't see the stain on the ceiling. You didn't see the funky looking Eastern Star thing over in the corner, the lighted pinball machine they've got, right? And so what I realized was that they had effectively controlled the senses of smell and sight and sound. They had controlled them and given everybody a unique experience that everybody in the room was going to hear the same thing, smell the same thing, and see the same thing. You weren't going to have two guys talking over here hearing something different. You weren't going to have some guys noticing the crack in the wall. And no, everything was going to be the same. And at that point, I realized that those three things, the music, the darkened lodge room with the candles and the incense, allowed us to make sure that everybody was having the same experience and having a good experience, right? So that's an integral part of what we do. At the end of the meeting, after the master closes the lodge, we're all down on the level. After the master closes the lodge and gavels, we gather around the altar for what we call the chain of union. And everybody crosses arms and grabs the hands of the ones next to you. And that's when the master gives the charge at closing. And when he's through with the charge at closing, everybody turns to their left and we circle around the altar as the worshipful master walks out the door, and everybody follows him in silence. And then once we're out of the room, well, then everybody goes, great meeting, fantastic, good to see you again. Those meetings are immediately followed by a festive board. And our festive boards are held at a local hotel. And so we have to get reservations in advance from everyone. Dinner is $50, but it's a steak dinner with salad and iced tea and cheesecake for dessert and all the trimmings, potatoes, green beans, of course, you have to have those. We have a festive board. During our 4 quarterly festive boards, we have 3 toasts. I learned this from Academia Lodge out in Oakland, California. They have 3 toasts that they call agape toasts. And these are toasts to Masonic symbols, principles, and so forth. So one meeting will toast wisdom, strength, and beauty. At another meeting, we'll toast the 3 principal officers. At another meeting, we may toast charcoal, and clay. I made a list of all the things in masonry that come in 3s. There's a lot of different toasts like this that you can do. And so that's what we do at our quarterly meetings, with the exception of July. July, when we install officers, that's what we call our annual assembly and feast. And if you'll recall, in 1717, when 4 lodges gathered at the Goose and Gridiron Ale House, they called it their annual assembly and feast. And so our annual assembly and feast is in the month of July. And at that meeting, we have the 7 traditional toasts that, start with the loyal toast at the very beginning and go down the list. And then the 7th toast is always the Tyler's toast. And that includes singing. So we have songs after every one of the toasts, and we do Masonic fire, which you're probably aware is, point left, right, point left, right, point left, right. I'm not going to do the whole thing, but if you don't know what that is, you need to come to our July meeting. Immediately after dinner, or while everybody's having their coffee and dessert, that's when we have a program. So every one of our quarterly meetings, we have a speaker who gives us a program about Freemasonry. And sometimes it's PowerPoint, sometimes it's not, but we've had great speakers and we've had great programs over the years. We've been doing this for over 30 years. And we haven't run out of programs anywhere near that. And so these programs usually last 20 to 30 minutes with questions and answers. And They're usually thought-provoking and interesting, and always about Freemasonry. Then, when we close with a prayer, we usually gather for drinks and cigars and snacks into the wee hours of the morning. And I mean, sometimes it's the wee hours of the morning. If the weather's nice, usually in the fall or the spring, we'll sit out back and smoke cigars and uh, have a scotch, or some of the guys will have a Coke or a beer. But that's where the really good conversations occur. We have visitors that will drive halfway across the state and will stay in a local hotel just to come and have this experience. Not just once, but once they do it, they'll come back again and again.
Oh, well, I will next time for sure, because I didn't get home until I think it was 4 a.m. when I left. And it was a thank goodness nobody else was on the road, because it was
Now, this
a
was not a
long
St. Albans.
curvy.
This wasn't a
Yeah,
St.
that
Albans.
was. Oh, that one wasn't. That was
That was
the
Sol
other
Ross.
festive board. That was a Sol Ross.
Yeah, they started doing those finally after, we've been doing them for 30 years. And they've got some young men that are now in the offices of Sol Ross Lodge who are also members of St. Albans. And so they're slowly but surely making some good changes at Sol Ross that are starting to make it a little bit more like St. Albans. And
Nice.
I hate to say that, because some of the old heads at Sol Ross do not want them to do anything like St. Albans Lodge.
Yes,
You spoke
that's.
of, you spoke
Go
about the
ahead.
business meetings at St. Albans, how they're, their business meetings. Several years ago, I was in College Station for some training, and I believe I spoke with you, and I came to a meeting, and it was a business meeting. But afterwards, I think we went to Outback Steakhouse, and y'all had a room, and then we went to your house after, and
Right.
that was it was a business meeting, but it was still that I came upon St. Albans at kind of a Masonic low point. And you say it's just a business meeting, but still the way that you handled business and the things that you did after made such a huge difference. It was a high spot in my Masonic experience. And I still look back fondly on that visit. And so y'all are doing fantastic things at St. Albans.
I'm glad to hear that. That I'm glad it had a good impression on you. I wish you'd come back to one of our quarterlies. Um, Actually, this year, the next quarterly will be in November,
Okay.
and it won't be on third Thursday. It'll be on second Thursday. So, but if you'll contact me in advance, I'll send you an invitation and give you the link for the PayPal, so you can buy a dinner ticket in advance. And we'd love to have you,
Yes,
right?
sir.
But there are a number of guys that do stay at a local hotel, and um, it's not like they come all the time. But if you came once or twice a year, uh, it's not going to break the bank, right? So you just got to take the next day off work. I want to mention, by the way, that we do wear tuxedos. That was something that we started back. You remember I said that before we started, there were 6 of us met at a local restaurant when we had little worksheets, and we went down, and I had an idea that it would be nice if the officers would wear tuxedos. And one of the other guys that was there that night said, "No, everybody ought to wear a tuxedo." And I said, "Wow, gee, I don't know if we can make that fly." And he goes, "The heck with them." He goes, "If they're not going to wear a tuxedo, they can go home and change. It's not a big deal, Or if they're coming straight from work, they can bring their tuxedo and change in the men's room, And I was like, okay. And I was outvoted 5-1. And so we all started wearing tuxedos. Like I said, that was 32 years ago, and we still do. And
Nice.
and it's not a requirement. There's been a few times when we've had a lodge member who maybe his wife one guy, his wife was in the hospital, and he couldn't go. He didn't have the time to go home and change into his tuxedo, so he just came dressed the way he was. And I think he was just wearing khaki slacks and a polo shirt, but that was fine, right? Right? We don't have a rule that says you have to wear it. It's just a tradition. That's all it is. And we've had people say, well, you got to wear a tuxedo to go to that lodge. Well, that's not true. We've had visitors show up that didn't know anything about us. They just knew we were meeting that night. We had 3 guys from Thornton show up one night, and they were in blue jeans and short sleeve plaid shirts. And we welcomed them with a warm handshake. We made them feel at home, and they came in and sat with us, and they enjoyed the meeting. And immediately afterwards, one of them came and said, I want to join this lodge. We were like, hold on. You came to one meeting and you want a petition. We have a little rule now that the rule is that the worshipful master needs to be your top line signer if you want to affiliate. But the worshipful master is not going to sign your petition to affiliate unless you've come to most of the meetings in the last year in a tuxedo. Nice. So if you come to 5 or 6 out of 7 meetings and you're wearing a tuxedo when you come and you're pretty faithful in your attendance, then we can talk about a petition for affiliation. And what that means is that when they finally affiliate, they feel like they've really done something. They feel like they've really been accepted. They're really part of the gang, right? The other thing we do is we always appoint an investigating committee. We always hold it over for a month or 2. And of course, we don't ballot on petitions except at our business meetings in February, June, and September. We don't ballot at our 4 quarterlies. So there's only 3 times a year when we'll ballot. But we always have a secret ballot. We do not vote by show of hands.
Yeah.
Good. That's good.
I like
practice.
that a lot.
We make them sweat it.
Well, I like the fact that you have the built-in time there also. I mean, we preach on the show all the time about having a 6-month period that you really need to get to know whoever's walking in the door before you start giving up a petition. And even with your process to where you want them to show up every year, and that or most of the meetings in a year. And then on top of that, you've got an extensive balloting or petition and investigation process. I mean, that really, really tips it over the edge. I really like that a lot. I really do.
Well, we started that years ago because we did have visitors that we knew. A lot of them we knew from Scottish Rite in Houston or wherever, and so they were friends of ours. But they would drive up here and they would come to one meeting, and then they would petition for affiliation, and we'd vote on them and we'd get them into the lodge, and then they stopped coming. And they'd pay their dues every year, and I'd send them a dues card, but they weren't really members of the lodge. And one of our members would bump into them at a Scottish Rite meeting, and they'd say, "Oh, I'm a member of St. Albans Lodge," and our members would say, "Well, gee, I never see you there." So we just didn't want to end up with a backlog of dues paying members that don't come to lodge. So you're going to have those anyway, but most of them went through the process and kind of proved themselves. The one last thing that I want to mention to you, because I think it's really important, is that I gave this talk back in 2010. They made me a Blue Friar up in Washington, D.C. area. The Blue Friars have one new member every year, and I was the 99th Blue Friar in 2010.
Wow.
And so I had to give a paper. And so I gave a paper about, it was called A Return to the Traditional Lodge Model. And I had a list of 10 things that I felt like were important. And I've given most of them to you here tonight. And I had started with 7 that John Mohilard created back in the 80s. If you don't know who John Mohilard was, or is, he's still with us. John Mohilard for a long time was the secretary of Old Number 2 in New York City. But he was not a New Yorker. Well, he became a New Yorker. He's from Portales, New Mexico. That's where he grew up. And he was a member of the Lodge of Portales, New Mexico. Portales, New Mexico is in eastern New Mexico, and kind of between Amarillo and Albuquerque, I guess. But as a young man in the early 70s, he went to New York City, and he was a senior DMLA. And so he found a bunch of other senior DMLAs, and they got together and they formed what they call the Goose and Gridiron Society. And the Goose and Gridiron Society met quarterly for a festive board at Francis Tavern. And they finally decided that they wanted to join a lodge. So they started poking around for a lodge in New York City to join, and they found Old Number 2, and they joined it, and they completely revamped it. They energized that lodge. And you know, today it's a great lodge because of their efforts. And it goes back to the 1700s. But John Mohilard, when he was president of the Philadelphia Society, he put together a list of 7 things that he called the 7 points of traditional Masonry. And I borrowed those 7 and I added 3 more. And so I gave this talk in 2010, but there was something that was missing from it, and I couldn't put my finger on it. And so one day I finally woke up and realized what was missing. And I kind of rearranged the list of 10 and combined a couple of them and added this additional item. And so I still had 10, right? And the 10th item that I added was decorum.
Mm.
And I think decorum during a lodge meeting is probably the single most important thing that will change a mundane business meeting into a really quality lodge experience. The one thing I want to rag on here is most lodges form committees of the whole. A lodge wants to have a picnic or a barbecue, or a lodge wants to buy some new aprons. And rather than appoint a committee to handle it and move on to the next item of business, instead, the lodge will sit there and argue for 30 minutes about how many new aprons they ought to buy. You know, the classic example is buying light bulbs. Somebody stands up and says, "Worshipful Master, I noticed that the light bulb is burnt out in the ladies' room. I think we need to buy some new. I'd like to make a motion that I be authorized to go buy 4 new light bulbs down at Walmart. And we'll put one in the ladies' room, and I'll put the other 3 in the kitchen so we can replace light bulbs in the future." And then Elbert stands up and says, "Worshipful Master, if we're going to buy light bulbs, why don't you let me go down to the co-op? I can buy a case of 144, and they're really good light bulbs, and we can get them a lot cheaper." And somebody else will stand up and say, "Worshipful Master, we don't need 144 light bulbs, but if you'll let me go to Sam's, I got a Sam's membership, and I can buy a dozen down at Sam's and get a really good price on them." And so the discussion goes on for the next 20 minutes. Meanwhile, you have some young master mason sitting over here, and this is his first stated meeting, and he's thinking to himself, "What in the world have I gotten myself into? I'm not coming back to any more of these meetings."
Well, and to make matters worse these days, you know, we're allowing the entered apprentices and the fellowcrafts in before they become masters. So they're seeing this before, and we wonder why we don't have so many. It's because they're lazy that they're not coming back. It's not because they've seen, you know, what we have in the 4 walls. You know, it's not because they've seen the true personality of our membership. It's because they're lazy and don't want to learn to work. You know, that's the biggest excuse of all lodges, it seems like.
No, I made this argument back when we were discussing and I think it was 2007. I think it was Donnie Broughton's year. we were discussing the idea of having stated meetings on the EA degree so that EAs and fellow crafts could attend our stated meetings. And I said to everybody, why in the world do you want to let our entered apprentices and fellow crafts come and see how bad our stated meetings are? Don't you realize that if they come to our stated meetings, they're probably going to drop out and not finish and get their master's? At least wait until they're a master mason and then let them come see how bad our stated meetings are.
Yeah,
St. Alban's Lodge does not meet on the entered apprentice degree. We hold our meetings on the master's degree.
If you wait till they're a master to bring them in, like what you're saying, it's really just a bait and switch, and that's what it was before they made the change, letting them in. Because I joined before you could sit in. I think maybe all of us did, but before you could sit in a stated meeting unless you're a master, and that was a goal for me to get to that point where I could sit in the lodge as a master. Now, granted, when I sat in there, it was the experience like you described. It was very underwhelming. However, I don't think the issue, me personally, I don't think the issue is that we're letting the EAs and fellow crafts in. I think you hit the nail on the head. I think the issue is that when they get in there, the meetings are terrible. It's going to have the same effect if you're an EA or a fellow craft or a master. If that's going to turn you off from Freemasonry, it doesn't matter what degree you're at that point, because you're just going to say, well, this is just the Lions Club with ritual, like you said, and they'll turn away. You can join the Lions Club. There's no degrees, there's no memory work. It's just a fee, and you're in. Why would you go through all this?
Exactly. Good point.
Well, I do believe that, ultimately it's my point being that it's not the EA or fellow craft's fault as often as is represented. It's always represented as they're lazy and they just don't want to learn the work. They don't want to, they just want to sit around and enjoy the fellowship, blah, blah, blah. There's multiple reasons for why people don't come back. And not one of those reasons is substantiated by any kind of data, because they're gone.
Right.
So you're not sending them a letter saying, why did you leave us?
Right. Well, I will tell you something, and this bears on it. Even the young men that go all the way to Master Mason and complete their Master Mason proficiency, 40% of them go suspended non-payment of dues before they turn 30 years of age. 40%. And I had a conversation with a couple of the members of the Grand Lodge membership committee about this very thing, because I knew that my mother lodge, Sol Ross Lodge, we have 50,000 undergraduates just down the road here at Texas A&M. So we get a lot of college students that we confer degrees on. And I was wondering how many of them go suspended on, what percentage go suspended on payment of dues. So I conducted a study, and I looked at every Master Mason we raised in my mother lodge from 1990 up to 2018, which was, and I just did this year. I just didn't want to look at anybody that had been raised in the last 5 years. I wanted only guys that had been Master Masons for 5 years or longer. So that's a 28-year period. And I went through and I realized that 40% of them, 40% of the Master Masons raised, and there was exactly 206 that had been raised during that 28-year period, and 6 of them were dead. So that left an even number of 200. And so then when I counted up the suspensions, non-payment of dues, it was 40%. I was so shocked that I called one of the members of the committee on membership. And I'm sorry, I've drawn a blank. He's secretary of Tannehill Lodge in Dallas. And I asked him, and he's an Aggie too, so he knows Sil Ross Lodge. And I said, what do you think the percentage was? And he said 40%. And I said, really? And he goes, yeah, that's kind of a statewide average. 40% go suspended in the first few years. And I was like, dang, I can't believe it's that high. And so we talked about what the solution might be. And what he said that they're planning to do at Tannehill is that they are raising their initiation fees. And I'm just going to pull a number out of the air. I think he said $1,600 for the 3 degrees. And in exchange
That's fair.
in exchange for that, they will get a book every time they get a degree, a selected book about masonry that they can take home and read. And when they get to be a master mason, they give them a apron with an apron case, and they make them an endowed member because they paid for it. Now,
Interesting.
St. Albans Lodge charges $2,000 for an endowed membership. And so if we were going to include degree fees, we would have to probably charge about $2,500 for the 3 degrees. Now, what that would do is it would slow down the number of petitions that we get from 18, 19, 20-year-olds, right?
Yes.
A number of them are going to go, well, maybe I can't afford that. Maybe I should wait, and that's probably a good thing, because if they wait until they're 28, 32 years of age, they're probably got there's a better likelihood that they're not going to go suspended, that they're going to remain. Because here's what happens. A young man who joins Masonry is single, he's in college, or maybe he's got a job, but he's single, living in an apartment, maybe living with his parents. I don't know. But what's going to happen before he turns 30? He's going to get married. His wife's going to have their first child. He's going to buy a car. He's going to buy a house and get up mortgage payments. He's going to have to buy a new car at some point. Hopefully he's got a decent job at that point. Okay. His whole life is going to change from the time he becomes a master mason at the age of 22 until he turns 30. And here's what happens. One day his wife is paying the bills, and she sees this envelope from Backwater Lodge number 123, and she says, what is this lodge bill? And he goes, oh, honey, I should have told you, I joined the Masons back when I was in college. And she goes, well, they want $100. And he says, yeah, I know, that's my annual dues. And she goes, holy smokes, they're going to want $100 every year? And he goes, yeah. And she's going to take that envelope, she's going to throw it in the trash, and she's going to say, we're not paying that. And he'll say, okay, that's fine. And that's the end of that. He's suspended non-payment of dues. That's
if I could only get back to $100.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
What is that, like a dish payment?
However much.
But you're absolutely correct. I mean, that is a big factor when it comes to the younger men, for sure.
Yeah.
I could definitely see that.
Well, if you do a study about the men that were 35 years of age when they became a master masons, they don't go suspended non-payment of dues. Right. Or if they do, it's when they're 89 years of age and they're in an old folks home and their daughter throws the dues notice away because she's paying his bills for him.
I think there's also something to say, and we've talked about this on the show, but I think there's something to say about having higher degree fees in general. Because if I pay $600, say, for an EA degree, I'm going to see it through. I mean, the higher the degree fees are, the more likely, if I pay this amount, I'm going to finish what I started. especially if you front load, if you have higher EA degree than like your fellow craft unit masters, you basically pay for it all anyway. You might as well finish it.
Well, that's what
Well,
we
what
talked about. In fact, one of the things we talked about was you don't necessarily have to extract the entire endowed amount in the 3 degree fees. So let's say that the endowed membership is $2,000, right? If you could get 1,200 from them that you could apply to an endowed membership as part of their degree fees, and they know that they have bought 60% of an endowed membership, they're not going to walk away from that 1,200. You tell them, look, we've got that 1,200 in the bank, right? All you have to do is come up with the other 800 and you got an endowed membership because you've already paid the first 1,200.
right.
What are the odds that he's going to walk away from that 1,200 and go suspended non-payment of dues? It's a lot lower than if he's walking away from nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the points that I was thinking when you were discussing the $1,600 is that, that's the equivalent of what the lodges were charging back when Goliad was founded in 1852. When you calculate inflation, I mean, that was basically what you were asking to become a Mason. Was it cost you around $1,800 to become a Mason.
That's
and
right.
So that's not unrealistic if we were to actually live by the same principles of yesteryear, and that goes along with our dues as well. We tend to we have devalued ourselves. We devalued the lodges first, and then our dues went along with it. Once we took away all the niceties of the lodge, then, or of the temple, I should say, then we started with the cheaper dues that reflect that as well. And
Right.
nobody finds value in going to that temple. They're not getting their senses tingled every time they go to lodge. They're in fact they're getting it tingled, except it's in a negative way. Their
Yeah.
nose is burning. It's not
It's
tingling.
that what was the term that
The
lodge,
eyes are burning. The nose is
the
running.
smell of the lodge, the lodge odor. That's what you're talking about. That's the tingling
Right.
nose.
So for all of our listeners, that was an over exaggeration, but there are some lodges that they have a lot to be desired. But we have devalued, and fortunately, we're in an era of transformation at this point, to where many lodges are starting to change their culture to be more like a St. Albans Lodge, and of course, we're not doing anything close to what y'all are doing, and I love the uniqueness in what y'all do, and I would love to get to that with several of my lodges. I don't know that I'll ever see it in my lifetime in a couple of them, but
Well,
but there's a couple that do
come and
have.
visit. You can steal whatever you want.
But it's like if you want to be a bodybuilder and say, "Hey, I want to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime." If you go to the gym once or twice, you're making progress. You're not looking like Schwarzenegger right away, but you have to chip away at that. It's the same thing. You can say, "I want to look like St. Albans." Well, look at best practice, what they're doing, and implement it as much as you can, and just keep pushing that boundary. And in time, like you said, you're planting trees that your children are going to take shade in, but you may never, right? You're building that up and setting that precedence to keep raising that bar.
Well, you can sit down and make a list. Make a list of the things that you'd like to see your lodge do that it's not doing now, and try to figure out how you can implement some of these things year by year, right?
Mhm.
And maybe the master says, well, I'll do these 3 things during my year. And the senior warden says, well, I'm going to do these 2 things during my year. And the junior warden, so on and so forth. I'm excited that my mother lodge is starting to do things like they had that festive board. Now they do one festive board a year, right?
Mhm.
But and I've learned that there's a lot of lodges that make a big deal about having one festive board a year. Seemingly, you ought to have four. I mean, we don't want to overdo it, because what we found out was the more meetings you have, the more absences you have, the more officers. Well, they won't come to 12, they'll come to 8 or 9, right? But we had one member that was pretty active, and he complained. He said, Pete, the problem is that St. Albans meets on the same night that my choir practices, because he's active in his church. And I said, yeah, but we only do it at that point in time, we were meeting 5 times a year. And I said, yeah, but we're only meeting 5 times a year. I said, you have 47 other Thursdays that you can go to choir practice.
That's awesome.
Well, I think the more often you do something, the less unique or special it feels. If you're meeting every, like some lodges meet twice a month, but if you're meeting quarterly, it feels more special, and you're going through the effort to make it actually. It doesn't just feel special, but when you go there, everything that you're doing is intentional to say, yes, this is something special, and it's different than any other lodge meeting.
Well, if
And
you go to London, if you go visit lodge in London, you will see that lodges typically meet about 5 times a year.
interesting.
They'll meet every other month from September to May, and then they'll be dark in the summer. And they don't know any different. They think that's the way it's supposed to be. And they'll come to this country and visit, and they'll see a lodge that's meeting 12 times, or good heavens, 24 times a year, and they think we're crazy. Well, they're right.
I agree.
Believe me, I agree. I'm a secretary of one that meets 24 times a year.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
Listen,
I'm surprised.
I want to talk to y'all again sometime. I've got a couple of really great programs that I think you'd be interested in. This was fun tonight, but I've done a little bit of research over the years, and I've got some programs that I think y'all might be interested in.
Yeah, we'd love to have you back on sometime. This is probably one of the densest episodes we had in a long time. There's a lot to unpack from what I've learned and what you shared this evening. So I'm really grateful that you took time out of your evening to come on here and share this with us.
Yes.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
What's interesting is last night we had a brother, after my presentation, a brother asked, he said, so explain to me, I love what we're doing. I love the education that we're doing in our lodge, but how does a brother determine if he's a good man becoming better? And I the only way that I could attribute it was you have to keep showing up for it to finally sink in. It's not, you're not always going to catch the reference on the very first time that you see it. So like you said, you kept, telling us we need to get over there and see it firsthand. And I think you're absolutely right. I think we do need to come by and see it. I think that once I thin out my schedule, I'm I'm a little overbooked myself. But once I thin out my schedule, I would love to come and visit. In fact, when you had mentioned it, I was looking at my calendar to see what I had open. I'm a little overbooked right now, but I want to. And I think that once I can experience it a few times, I'll actually be able to really take those nuggets back and explain it and teach it with purpose for the lodges I belong to. And I think that there's a lot of great takeaways in what we've discussed tonight, for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Seeing is believing, right?
Yep.
Yep.
Well, I believe it anyways. I mean, I've seen the library over that you built. We didn't even mention that tonight. I mean, the library that you and your wife built. I mean, that is amazing.
there was a lot of people contributed to that. When I was junior deacon of the lodge, Dr. Cliff Ransdell, who, by the way, is a past Grand High Priest for the Grand Royal Arch Chapter, he was Associate Dean of the Engineering College here for many years. He was Associate Dean of Engineering when my father went to school in the late 40s, and he was still Associate Dean when I went to school in the late 60s. And
Wow.
he was a past master of the lodge, and he came to me back about 1980, and he said, "You know, Pete," he said, "at one point your father-in-law, who was a developer in College Station, he said your father-in-law said that at one time he might have some land that he could donate to the lodge to build a new building." He said, "Could you work on him?"
Yeah.
And I said, "Sure, but it's one thing to have a piece of land. It's something else to have the money to build a building on it." So we had to raise money.
Hmm.
And so I had talked to Dr. Tommy up in Fort Worth, who's past Grandmaster, and he told me what they did in Fort Worth, turning that building into a 501c3. And then I found out that the Lee Lockwood Library in Waco is a 501c3. And I'm not a lawyer, so I had to find out about all this, And we created a 501c3 corporation back in the 80s when I was Worshipful Master. Um, and it and we named it the Brazos Valley Masonic Library and Museum. And the idea was that way people could make donations that were tax exempt, tax deductible.
Mhm.
And so we started raising money, and the money came little by little, but it took us 15 years, and it got to be the late 90s, and we still didn't have enough money. If we sold the old building and took the money we'd raised over 15 years, we still didn't have enough to build a new building. And one of our past masters died. One of our early past masters died, and it was Brother Madeley, the old pharmacist that I told you about. He died. He didn't have any kids, and in his will, he left us enough money to put us over the top. And so with that, then we were able to build the building that we have now. And it's not a huge building. It's about 5,500 square feet, but it has a nice lodge room. The lodge room we have is the exact same size as our original lodge room. It has a secretary's office. It has storage space. It has a dining room and a kitchen, restrooms, and it has a nice library. So we got everything we wanted,
Mhm.
and now we're even talking about expanding it a little bit.
Well, it is a
Some things.
very nice building.
Yes. I was dumbstruck when I went in there. I truly just walking in and seeing the building without lodge in session or anything was just amazing.
Yeah.
Y'all did such a great job.
Yes.
And you could tell that a lot of thought was put into it and tender love and care. You could definitely tell that there was a lot of TLC and a lot of attention to detail, and even the hanging of the coffee mugs, even that looks purposeful. I mean, it didn't look like it was just a bunch of old mugs just thrown in there thrown in a different cabinet or something with stains on the with stains on the napkins that they were sitting on top of. It was, y'all have a very nice display, and everything that's done in that lodge, everything looks very purposeful, and I think it truly deserves to be called a temple, in my opinion, because it does represent the best of what masonry can offer.
Yes.
It's a library museum.
Well,
I got a phone call the other day from a lady who was at the front door, and they have my phone number on the front door of the building. And so she called me, and she had her father's Knight Templar regalia and sword, and she wanted to donate it. And I jumped up and drove down there and met her, and she told me all about her father and who he was, He was a member of the lodge at Yoakum, and I know you know where Yoakum is.
I do.
Yeah, he was a member of the lodge at Yoakum, and he died back about 2007, I think. And she said at that time I couldn't turn loose of these things, but she said now I have to find a home for it. And I said, well, we'll take good care of it.
Hmm.
You know.
That's
Well, Brother
awesome.
Norman, I want to be respectful of your time. Unless you had anything else, does anyone have any final thoughts they'd like to share? Like I said, I don't want to keep everyone up very late tonight. If
No, I appreciate y'all inviting me. I'd be happy to talk to anybody about what we're doing. Somebody else may want to cherry pick some of these ideas, maybe not all of them, but just some of them, and that's perfectly fine. I used to always say, everybody has to skin their own cat however they can. It's very difficult to take an existing lodge and completely change the culture of the lodge. It's much easier to start a brand new lodge and create the culture you want from the get-go. And that's what we did 32 years ago.
I love it. So, Dennis, did you have anything you wanted to
add? I think that this has been a spectacular interview, and I can't wait for the next one. I truly appreciate your time and thought into this. You came to this interview much like I did when I interviewed with Justin the very first time before we became a duo, and you came prepared and intentional in everything that you said, and it's just spot on. It really is everything that I had hoped for, and I am grateful for your time. I'm grateful for you coming on this show.
Absolutely.
I think that Texas Masons and Masons around the world, we have listeners and viewers all over, even over in Australia, and you know they're going to enjoy this episode, I'm sure.
Yes.
Great.
Well, thank you again for coming on, and like Dennis said, like we would love to have you again. But
thank you.
We'll go wrap up here. Thanks everyone for watching. See you in the next episode.